Good day. Today is Friday, 26 September 2025, and today we start the programme with further news of a confrontation, a diplomatic confrontation, which has taken place in Moscow between the representatives of three European powers, Britain, France and Germany, and the Russian Foreign Ministry. Now, we have information about this event. The primary information for this event comes from Bloomberg, but the Russians have confirmed that the incident did take place, though they are not confirming Bloomberg's details. Anyway, supposedly the representatives, presumably the ambassadors or the senior diplomatic representatives of Britain, France and Germany, went to the Russian Foreign Ministry, met there with a senior Russian Foreign Ministry official. We are not told who this person was. We are told that this person, whoever he or she was, took careful notes of what the European powers were saying. And the story, according to Bloomberg, is that the European powers then told the Russians, told this foreign ministry official, that further Russian incursions into European airspace were unacceptable, and that they gave some kind of a warning that if there were further incursions of that kind, then the European powers would be prepared to shoot down any Russian aircraft that strayed into European airspace down. And Bloomberg then continues by saying that over the course of the discussion, the Russians appeared to admit that the incursion, and this appears to refer specifically to the incursion allegedly by the three MiG-31 fighter jets of Estonian airspace, had been intentional, and that this event was intended by the Russians as some kind of response to the various Ukrainian attacks on Crimea, which the Russians apparently told the Europeans the Russians believe the Ukrainians are unable to carry out without assistance from Europe. I think this part of the discussion has been distorted by whoever has been informing Bloomberg of what happened, though I think it is not actually difficult to work out what the nature of this exchange was all about. Anyway, the overall story here is that the Russians gave a defiant response to the Europeans. They appear to have told the Europeans basically to shove off. Now, there is many problems with this account. First of all, it should be said that there is no actual agreement in Europe about shooting down Russian aircraft that stray into European airspace. So the Prime Minister of Italy, Giorgia Meloni, has counselled against rushing to do this. The President of France, Emmanuel Macron, who, it must be said, changes his position at bewildering speed, but he has publicly said that simply shooting down Russian aircraft, if they enter European airspace or NATO airspace, would be wrong. Warnings must be given first and things of that kind. So anyway, it doesn't seem as if, as far as we can see, the French are fully signed up for this. And in Germany, the German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius has echoed the concerns expressed by Macron and Meloni. So we see that the Defense Minister of Germany and the President of France are at least publicly pushing back against the very threat that the Russians were supposedly warned about over the course of this meeting in Moscow. So there is already some reason to have doubts that the exact description of what took place that's been provided to Bloomberg is fully true. Now, let's turn to that other claim made by Bloomberg, or at least by those who briefed Bloomberg about this conversation, that the Russians sort of admitted that their planes had indeed infringed Estonian airspace, but that they said that this was some kind of response on Russia's part to the attacks by the Ukrainians on Crimea. Now, the fundamental problem with that claim is that it is straightforwardly and fully contradicted by what the Russians are openly saying. Now, Putin's spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, has in fact commented about this meeting. He, in effect, has admitted that the meeting did indeed take place, and we have the Russian account of what Peskov said set out in TASS. And this is what TASS says that Peskov said. Commenting on a Bloomberg report, the diplomats from Britain, Germany and France met with Russian officials to protest alleged violations of Polish and Estonian airspace and to warn of their readiness to shoot down Russian aircraft. Peskov said, "I don't want even to talk about this." It's a very irresponsible statement. It's very irresponsible because the accusations against Russia that its military aircraft violated someone's airspace and invaded someone else's one are groundless. No convincing evidence of this has been presented. And then the article goes on to say that reporters asked Peskov to comment on Bloomberg's report that at a close meeting, the Russian representatives allegedly admitted to violating the airspace of Western countries in response to strikes on Crimea. And then TASS says that Peskov replied, "Ask Bloomberg where they got this information." So, effectively, essentially, Peskov is saying that this claim is completely untrue and that whoever it was who briefed Bloomberg is straightforwardly lying. If you read Peskov's comments as TASS is reporting them, I get the impression that the story about the warning of shooting down Russian aircraft and the claim about the admission that the Russians supposedly made that their aircraft deliberately invaded Estonian airspace. I suspect that this is basically reworking or inflating or exaggerating what actually took place. Now, I said that the French president and the German defense minister appeared to argue against any hurried moves to shoot down Russian aircraft, and we can see that Peskov is categorically denying that Russian aircraft did intentionally cross into Estonian airspace. So, putting all this together, knowing what we know about what Macron and Pistorius have said, taking into account the public statements made by the Russians, including Peskov, here is what I think took place. A meeting in Moscow did take place. Western officials did indeed protest vigorously to the Russians about the incursions, the alleged incursions by the Russians of NATO airspace. They might have said that if this does continue, then NATO, the Western powers, will defend themselves against incursions of this kind, and that might result in aircraft being shot down. But I think that they stopped short of actually threatening that, because it goes beyond what the senior officials, in fact the leader in the case of France and Germany, have publicly said. I do not believe that the Russians, at any point over the course of this conversation, admitted either expressly or implicitly that they had intentionally infringed Estonian airspace. I think what the Russians said is that it's all very rich, you people coming to us and talking to us about us infringing your airspace, when the reality is that the only people who are infringing anybody's airspace on a continuous and routine basis is you, because every day, practically, attacks by drones and sometimes missiles on Crimea take place, and none of this could happen even though it is the Ukrainians who supposedly are the attackers. None of this could happen without your direct involvement. After all, British and French Storm Shadow and Scout missiles have been used in attacks on Crimea, as, by the way, have ATACMS missiles supplied to Ukraine by the United States. So I think this is what took place. And someone who is intent on making trouble has gone to Bloomberg and has made it seem that this already very tense and difficult and confrontational meeting that took place in Moscow was even more confrontational and even more tense than it actually was, with Western warnings about possible future escalations and shooting down of Russian aircraft being amplified into an outright threat to shoot down Russian aircraft, and words by the Russians which brought up Crimea being spun to make it seem that the Russians were admitting to airspace allegations against Estonia and were justifying them, again, by reference to attacks, Western-sponsored attacks on Crimea. Now, as to who might have been providing this information to Bloomberg, well, of course, I don't know, but I'm going to make a very simple and very shrewd guess. There were 3 representatives of Western countries involved in these discussions in Moscow. We're told by Bloomberg that there were diplomats from Britain, France, and Germany there. It seems on the face of it unlikely that it was the Germans or the French, because after all, the German defense minister, Boris Pistorius, has spoken out against the idea of simply shooting down Russian fighter jets, and the French President Emmanuel Macron has also apparently spoken out against the idea of simply shooting down Russian fighter jets or indeed any kind of aircraft. So that, by a process of elimination, leaves the British. And the British, of course, have been consistently the most hawkish and aggressive and confrontational amongst all of the major European powers against Russia. And by the way, given how confrontational all of them are, that is saying a great deal. Anyway, I don't know this for a fact, and I want to make this very clear, but my working hypothesis is that it was the British who briefed Bloomberg, and that it was the British who spun this story in the way that I have just described. So there it is. So anyway, a difficult meeting in Moscow. And the key thing to say about this whole setup is that, of course, doing so, holding this kind of meeting at all, is itself, in a kind of a way, escalatory. Notice that the British, French, and German diplomats who made these representations on behalf of their governments represent countries whose airspace the Russians are not accused of having violated. Estonia claims that its airspace has been violated. Poland claims that its airspace was violated by the decoy drones. And let me repeat again, in relation to that specific incident, that the Russians have offered to meet with the Poles to discuss this incident in detail and to perhaps see a way forward to finding out what happened. And that offer has never been accepted by the Poles, and it is barely ever talked about or discussed in the West. And then we've had this strange incident with the MiG-31 fighters over the Baltic Sea. And as I said in previous programs, it looks as if these fighter jets were simply traveling from a Russian airbase in Karelia to another Russian airbase in Kaliningrad, and perhaps they came closer to an uninhabited rock in the Baltic Sea, which falls within Estonian territory. But whatever, this doesn't look as if it was intended to be an aggressive incident, even supposing that that is true, which of course the Russians deny. And we've had claims about a Russian drone that is supposed to have crossed into Romanian airspace, but there's never been any evidence confirming even its existence. And there were recently stories about drones flying over airports in Denmark and causing flights there to be delayed. And of course the story has been planted and it's all over the media that these were Russian drones, but the Danish authorities admit that they don't know. They say that it was a professional operation, whatever that means, but they don't actually have any proof as to whose those drones actually were. So a whole story, a whole set of stories, which each one of these incidents in and of itself, it seems to me, amounts to very little. I won't say exactly to zero, though perhaps you could argue that with the incident about the Danish drones, but very close to being zero. Decoy drones that might have strayed into Polish airspace by accident, or, as some believe, might have been the result of a Ukrainian false flag. I say some believe. Opinion polls in Poland have suggested that most Poles think that. And MiG-31 fighter jets that flew over the Baltic Sea to go from one Russian airbase to another Russian airbase. If you multiply the number zero by any number, the answer is still zero. So people who pile up each one of these incidents on top of the other and claim that this is all in its aggregate proof of some kind of Russian aggressiveness are going far beyond the evidence, because the evidence in each case is so slight. Not perhaps exactly zero, but much closer to zero than, say, 1. So there it is. That's my view. And certainly this did not merit, this did not justify coming along to Moscow, traveling to the Russian Foreign Ministry, delivering this kind of démarche. I believe it is actually, properly speaking, a démarche, making either express or implicit threats to shoot down Russian aircraft. And, well, we can see how angrily Peskov has reacted. Now, this is a very dangerous game, but it's easy to understand what is happening. Somebody, and when I say somebody, it's obviously many people, seem intent on escalating even further a very dangerous and very critical situation in Northern Europe and in the Baltic area specifically. And, well, there may be other explanations beyond the conflict in Ukraine as to why this is happening. For example, the Belarusian president, Alexander Lukashenko, has just confirmed that Belarus is about to receive its first Oreshnik missile. I say Belarus is about to receive the first Oreshnik missile. Perhaps I should correct that. As I understand it, the first Russian Oreshnik missile is due to enter Belarus and will do so from any day now, though I understand that it will continue to be operated whilst in Belarus by Russian personnel. And given the power of the system, against which there is no defense, one can perhaps understand why some people in Northeast Europe are becoming nervous. The Poles recently made a big play of the Zapad 25 exercises that took place there. Those have ended, by the way, with no untoward incident at all. The Poles, for a time, perhaps still, closed all the roads and railway links between their countries and Belarus, angering, by the way, the Chinese, who transport goods via Belarus to Europe through these roads, these rail links and roads. So it could be that, as I said, these Russian military deployments and the Oreshnik deployment in Belarus have a part to play. Undoubtedly, worries about the situation, the military situation in Ukraine, play a significant role also. But underpinning everything, the true cause of all this alarm and nervousness and fear in Europe is the unpredictable policies of the United States, of its president, that is making everybody, all the major governments in Europe, very alarmed and extremely uneasy. Notice that though the British, French, and German diplomats went to the foreign ministry in Moscow to deliver their démarche, the Americans were not there to join them. If the Americans had been there, it would have been proper to take this incident very seriously. But the Americans were not. The Americans don't seem to be taking any one of these incidents at all seriously. On the contrary, the Americans have indicated to the Europeans that they're scaling down their force postures in the Baltic, that they're ending or reducing some of their financial assistance programs to the Baltic militaries. And all of this following statements by the President of the United States at the UN and in his Truth Social post, which seemed to call into question American long-term commitment to Ukraine. On the contrary, the President seems intent on delegating, on shuffling off the entire burden of assistance to Ukraine upon the Europeans. And as I discussed in my program yesterday, the article in the Financial Times has made it crystal clear that the Europeans are extremely alarmed and angry about it, because they understand, even if Vladimir Zelensky doesn't, that without the Americans, continued assistance, Western assistance to Ukraine will never be anywhere close to being enough. Now, that it is alarm about American behavior, about the fact that the Americans are quietly pulling back from their commitment to Ukraine, that they're doing so in, if I may say so, a not untypical American way, claiming that they're advancing and winning victory, achieving victory. At least that's what Trump's Truth Social post seemed to imply. And it wasn't, of course, the Americans, it was the Ukrainians. But the Ukrainians, as we know, are American allies, claiming victory whilst they are pulling out. The Americans have done this many times in a kind of a way. They did it in South Vietnam. They did it, of course, in Afghanistan. And arguably, they are doing it now all over again. They're saying that they have won, and the situation in Ukraine is now so much under control, so far under the control of the Ukrainians, that there really isn't any need for the Americans to be further involved. Anyway, not untypical for the way that the Americans behave. I don't like it myself, as I made clear, but there it is. But for the Europeans, they've clearly seen right through it, and they're not happy, and they're very frustrated and very upset and angry about it. And it seems to me that all of these escalations, this pattern of escalations by the Europeans, these attempts to play up these minor incidents of a sort, by the way, that take place all the time. Mysterious drones appear close to airports. It's happened to me, by the way, when I was flying into one airport, to Heathrow to be precise, that there were delays in the flight because of talk about unknown drones having been located in the area. Claims about mysterious drones flying over Danish airports, drones, decoy drones entering Poland for no reason that anybody can satisfactorily explain. As I said, MiG fighter jets crossing from one air base to another air base, and perhaps without fully knowing what they've done, veering slightly into Estonian airspace. I mean, it's possible. Anyway, these sort of things happen all the time. But of course, if you want to bring the Americans back in, if you want to get them further involved, then play this all up, make it all seem like a crisis, make it all seem as if the bear is indeed on the prowl, that the bear is testing Europe's air defences and finding them wanted, that the United States cannot afford to abandon the Europeans, because if it does, then the Russians, the perennially aggressive Russians, the Russians who are hardwired to be aggressive, who are compulsively aggressive, even when they're weak and useless, and when aggressiveness really makes no sense for them. The Russians, if the Americans pull out, will immediately and automatically and without any possible delay take advantage. And there's been a really fine article explaining all of this in Responsible Statecraft, the journal of the Quincy Institute, and its title, Trump's latest line is on Ukraine isn't a shift, it's a hands off. The president's rhetoric may have changed, but the substance largely remains. The US pulling back while Europe inherits the risk. And the writer of the article is Eldar Mamedov. And to summarize the article briefly, the article says that in a sense the Europeans have been the victims of their own success because they've conducted, since Trump came into office, an influence campaign over Trump. They've tried to persuade him that the Russians are weak, that they're not doing that well on the battlefronts, that the Russians aren't really interested in peace. And whilst that has been successful in persuading Trump to drop his pressure on Zelensky, to force Zelensky to come to terms with the Russians on the basis of Russian demands, it has not succeeded in persuading Trump to recommit to Ukraine, because the one thing, despite all of the zigzags of his policies, that Trump remains consistent about is his determination to get the United States out of direct involvement in Ukraine. To quote Mamedov's exact words, whilst the tone has swung from advocating a deal to cheering for victory, the underlying substantive policy, American disengagement, has remained remarkably consistent. Whereas before, Trump argued that Ukraine should cede land because the United States should not be involved. Now he argues Ukraine can win back its land because the United States should not be involved. The core American first principle of avoiding costly entanglements is unchanged. Only the public justification for it has flipped to accommodate political pressures. And Mamedov also points out that Trump is not alone in expressing this determination by the Americans to disengage directly from the conflict in Ukraine. US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, who sometimes gives the impression of being a hardliner on Russia, recently laid bare the doctrine's stark logic, dismissing fears of Russian expansion by stating, "All I hear from you," that's to say the Europeans, "is that Putin wants to march into Warsaw. The one thing I am sure of is that Putin isn't marching on Boston." This statement is a clear signal, this goes back to Mamedov, that the administration's fundamental priority is insulating the American homeland, not defending the NATO frontier, much less a non-NATO state like Ukraine. So this is what is causing the Europeans to become alarmed, and that is why they are now so busy playing up incidents of this kind. This meeting, which has taken place in Moscow, and the careful way in which it has been reported, or in which the people who briefed Bloomberg have made sure it is reported, is intended to impress the Americans, not so much the Russians. The Russians are simply the board upon which this story is flung. It is the Americans who are the ones who are expected to be listening. Now, it's most unlikely that this is going to succeed. In fact, there is no evidence that the Americans so far are impressed by any of this. But Mamedov talks about this too. He says the primary lever the Europeans use to achieve American re-engagement is the very incidents in European airspace. If these continue or escalate, for instance, if a Russian aircraft is shot down, European calls for Trump to intervene will grow louder and more frequent. Significantly, a significant change on the front lines in favour of either side, and that's true by the way, could drastically alter his calculus. And that change is likely to come before very long, and we will talk about it shortly in this programme. And then Mamedov makes the entirely right point. The fatal flaw in this entire dynamic is that it incentivizes escalation. Kiev and its allies need dramatic events to entangle a Washington that has explicitly signalled its unwillingness to fight for Warsaw, let alone Kiev. So there we are. Mamedov says other things. He also says, I think, and here I agree with him less, that the Russians might also feel compelled to act sharply to disprove the paper tiger label. Trump, by the way, has tried to walk that back. He had a meeting with a foreign leader yesterday, I forget which one, and he said that he would never use the expression paper tiger again. But, well, it's out there now. There's nothing to be done about it. I don't myself think that the Russians take it very seriously. But, as Mamedov says, certainly the incentives for Ukraine and the Europeans to escalate creates a perfect storm for a catastrophic miscalculation. The overwhelming risk is that the moment will be misjudged. A policy designed to profit from prolonged conflict is not a strategy for security. It is a recipe for a direct NATO-Russia confrontation that the US has already suggested it would seek to avoid. The only way to prevent this is to reject the siren song of brinkmanship and prioritize genuine diplomacy before the logic of escalation takes over entirely. Which comes back to what I've been saying in programme after programme, and what I said at length in my programme yesterday, that some sincere and genuine diplomatic engagement with Moscow by the European states is now massively overdue and urgently needed. But anyway, there it is. An attempt, clearly, to intensify the already growing sense of tension in Europe, to make the situation appear even worse than it already is, all done in a desperate bid to get the Americans back involved. The Russians, as Peskov's response shows, are very angry, and that is going to have an effect in the long term. But for the moment at least, behind gritted teeth, seem determined to act prudently and carefully in this situation, where accomplished chess players, as of course they are, they sense that they are now absolutely in the end game again in a game which they know they're going to win. So anyway, let's quickly add to all of that certain comments by Kaja Kallas, the High Representative of European diplomacy, the European Union. Kaja Kallas has come out and she's said that the United States cannot disengage from Ukraine. She's fasted on, she's pointed out, and by the way, she's done so correctly, though it might have been wiser for her not to point this out, that when Trump talks about NATO backing Ukraine, he appears to overlook the fact that the United States is itself a part of NATO. And that must mean, according to Kaja Kallas' logic, that American disengagement cannot happen because since NATO is involved, the United States, of course, by definition, also is involved in supporting Ukraine. And Kaja Kallas is not wrong. My colleague and friend, Alex Christoforou, has absolutely rightly pointed out that when Donald Trump talks about the fact that the United States is selling weapons to NATO, for NATO to pass on to Ukraine, to some extent at least, given that it is the United States that mostly funds NATO, this is the United States moving money from one pocket into another pocket. American taxpayers continue to bear part of the burden still for arming Ukraine. However, this can conceal the extent to which President Trump and his officials, and he's far from alone in doing this, have recently taken to talking about NATO as if NATO was something distinct and separate and even independent of the United States. If we go back to that famous or infamous Truth Social post, the one in which Trump appeared to be cheering the Ukrainians on to victory and calling Russia a paper tiger, he spoke in that Truth Social post of NATO as if NATO was an entirely distinct entity from the United States, one in which the United States was not involved. Now, factually, of course, that is absurd. But conceptually and rhetorically, it is unprecedented. I cannot imagine any earlier American president since the Second World War, since NATO's founding, who would have spoken about NATO in quite that way, who would have, for example, as Trump did previously, complain noisily that NATO continues to buy oil from Russia. NATO, when he really means the European states plus Turkey, but appears to be excluding the United States. It's as if, in Trump's mind, there is NATO, the US allies in Europe, and of course Canada too, and then there is the United States, which is both inside it and outside it, both at the same time. Now, no other president, as I said, since NATO's founding, would ever have spoken of NATO in this way. And of course, Trump using this kind of language, and by the way, when he spoke at the United Nations General Assembly a few days ago, some of his rhetoric was also not that different from this. Anyway, using this kind of rhetoric, Trump is definitely calling into doubt his own personal sense of commitment and of American commitment to NATO. I can't escape the feeling that this president doesn't regard the NATO allies as truly allies. He sees them as vassals, as underlings, people who can be bullied and exploited, but he doesn't really feel any genuine, deep, true sense of obligation to defend them. If a position were ever to arise where America's very existence might come under risk, if the US were indeed to stand by its NATO allies, then I don't think that this president, all other things being equal, would be prepared to take that risk. Anyway, I might be wrong here, but I am sure that there are many people in Europe, in NATO, who quietly think this, and there must be much agonizing and much fear about this, and very, very great anger. Now, in terms of American policy, there has been a certain amount of confusion, worry, perhaps even alarm, because the US Defense Secretary, Pete Hegseth, has suddenly issued a summons ordering all US senior military officials, all generals and brigadier generals and admirals and air chiefs and all of those people, to come to the United States to attend a meeting, the purpose of which has not been disclosed, but which is to be chaired by Pete Hegseth himself. And there is much uncertainty as to what this meeting is about. There are rumors that the President of the United States, Donald Trump, himself intends to attend, though when asked about this meeting, I ought to say that the President gave the impression that as far as he was concerned, this meeting was no big deal. Now, to be very clear, we've not been told what the purpose of this meeting is, and I do not know what the purpose of this meeting is. A number of people, Larry Johnson, for example, have pointed out that one consequence of this meeting is that we now know the staggering disproportion in terms of numbers of generals and numbers of serving soldiers in the US military. That there is one general now for every 1,000 soldiers, whereas during the Second World War there was one general for every 6,000 soldiers. That this is a very top-heavy military, or at least it has become so. Well, that's one view, and it may very well be, and it would not be uncharacteristic of this administration, that someone is determined within the administration to cut out the dead wood, and that this is an opportunity. This meeting is about doing that. It's about telling the generals that there's too many of them, that they're all going to have to reapply for their jobs or something like that, and that there's going to be a purge of the ranks. That would not be surprising, though I have to say, calling a meeting of this kind in this way does seem to be a very strange way to do it, and I would have thought that it could have been done in a more careful and perhaps humane way. But anyway, that's one possibility. The other possibility that others are floating is that this is all a vanity trip by an insecure defense, or is that now war secretary, Pete Hegseth, that he feels that he's constantly the target of innuendo and criticism, and that he's bringing everybody together to this meeting basically to prove, mostly to himself, that he is indeed still the boss. And that's not impossible. The third possibility, which I think is a much more real one, is that the United States, the administration, wants to brief all of these generals ahead of a future military confrontation with someone. China? Possibly, but unlikely. Russia? Possibly, but I would have said also very unlikely. Venezuela? Very possibly. Larry Johnson has written a very fine piece on Sonar 21 about how an attack on Venezuela now looks like only a matter of time. And I agree. I mean, as I've discussed in previous programs, you do not deploy 13% of the US fleet, including guided missile destroyers and F-35 aircraft within range of Venezuelan territory, simply in order to intercept speedboats that you say are being used by drug smugglers. I mean, clearly some kind of military campaign is being prepared. And I am sure of this, and probably this is going to play out at some point over the next couple of days or weeks. In fact, I'm surprised that it is taking as long as it is taking. Anyway, so you might want to call all these important people together to discuss this, though there is an argument against this, which is that I cannot imagine that the administration considers Venezuela such a difficult target. Surely one could carry out an attack of this kind on a country like Venezuela without requiring the entire military leadership of the United States to drop everything else that they are doing in order to come to the United States to hear a speech about it by Pete Hegseth. The other possibility is that, of course, this is all about Iran. And here I'm afraid there is a real chance that we could find ourselves in exactly that kind of scenario. Iran is a far more formidable challenge for the United States than, in my opinion, Venezuela is. I discussed in my program yesterday the reports that are now circulating, in fact, the comments that have been made by a senior Iranian official in Tehran, that Iran has now received its first fighter jets directly from Russia in the form of MiG-29s, that Sukhoi 35s and S-400s are also on the way, all of which, taken in aggregate, would drastically change the entire strategic calculus in the Middle East. So it seems to me that if the United States is planning a war against Iran, and based on the real possibility that this could be a long war, and based also on the further possibility that the United States must see that the Russians and undoubtedly the Chinese will want to play a role in that war on Iran's behalf, at the very least as an arms and weapons supplier. I can imagine, given how complex and risky such a war would be, the size of the forces involved, that the United States might feel that the entire leadership of the United States, military leadership of the United States, might need to be briefed about it. What I find difficult as being needed for a war against Venezuela would probably make better sense if there is now a plan for a war against Iran. And that there is such a plan, I've said already that I don't personally have any doubt. In a few weeks' time, the snapback sanctions on Iran are going to be reimposed. China and Russia have said that they will defy them. The US, a few days ago, imposed sanctions on the port of Chabahar in Iran. This is a sensitive issue because the port was built by India, which invested very heavily in its construction, and which sees Chabahar itself as a strategic interest for India. So sanctioning this port, attempting to close off all shipping to this port, obviously is a strong action against Iran, but it is one that the Indians must have been very angry about. Apparently the decision was communicated to them 7 days ago, and they was given a couple of days in which to basically pull out of Chabahar. There's no word that they have done so. And anyway, India now has to assess whether it should simply write off the entire massive investment in Chabahar by indeed pulling out, or whether it should defy US sanctions by sticking with Iran and continuing to develop Chabahar. Not a move that India would have welcomed. By the way, on that topic, there are reports circulating, and I believe they're also coming from Bloomberg, that India has told the United States that India will only consider reducing its buying of Russian oil if the United States first lifts its sanctions on oil exports by Venezuela and Iran. So we could see that all of these things link up with each other. So calling these military officials together for such a meeting, if the plan is to attack Iran, might just make sense. But here is my view as to why this meeting is taking place. I think it is related to the new security strategies which are coming out of the Pentagon and which are associated in the media space, at least, with Elbridge Colby. And according to reports, because I've never seen the actual text of these National Review documents. Anyway, security review documents. Anyway, according to the reports, the United States is now going to start pulling back from various places around the world, from Europe, from the Middle East perhaps, conceivably even from East Asia, because it intends instead to concentrate on the defense of the American homeland and on the Western Hemisphere. Now, this is not going to be universally popular with the American military leadership. Many of them have had long years of service outside the Western Hemisphere, in the Middle East, in Europe. They are accustomed to the view of the United States as the world's first and primary superpower, or even hyperpower. Talk that the United States might be pulling back and concentrating on defending its own might not be very popular with some of them. So I think that this is an attempt to bring the military leadership together, to explain to them the policy. So there'll be speeches by Hegseth and Colby and possibly by Trump as well, explaining the new policy and explaining to the military officials that this is a policy backed fully by the president and by the civilian authority. And I think that this is the most likely explanation. But that's my guess. And one can see why in this very fraught situation that we are in, with all these maneuvers and games being played in the Baltic and elsewhere, there is nervousness, and the fact that this meeting is being convened is adding to that sense of nervousness, even to a sense of crisis. Now, here I would quickly and very briefly touch on another article that Arnaud Bertrand has written on his Substack blog. He talks about how there's been a whole series of further steps and decisions by the United States over the last week, including the telephone conversation between Donald Trump and Xi Jinping, all of which appears to point to an American policy of, well, maybe not total withdrawal, but scaling down in Asia and focusing on North America and on the Western Hemisphere instead. It is an interesting article. I am not sure that I fully agree. I think that the United States has absolutely not yet fully committed itself to such a course. But of course, if it has, then that dovetails very well with the meeting of the American military officials and the reasons for calling it, which I have just discussed. Anyway, there we go. So, a very tense situation, a possible crisis in the Baltic, the frenetic attempts by the Europeans to escalate the crisis in Europe between the West and Russia, and, well, let's now turn to the military situation in Ukraine. But before we do, let's talk a little bit about President Zelensky, because President Zelensky has now, in effect, been given what he has wanted. He's been given the green light by the United States to try to recapture all of Ukraine's lost territories, to reach the 2014 borders and even to fight beyond them. He, of course, didn't want a ceasefire. It's overlooked that he was only persuaded to accept a ceasefire under immense American pressure back in March. Up to then, he'd consistently rejected talk of a ceasefire or of a frozen conflict. On the contrary, he wanted the Americans and the Europeans to give him all the resources that he wanted so that he could win the war against Russia. And what he now finds, perhaps to his surprise and astonishment, though I suspect also to his alarm, is that he's suddenly been given everything that he wanted in terms of being told by the Americans, well, we actually are no longer going to press you to agree a deal with the Russians. Just go on fighting, and you tell us you can win, so just go ahead by yourself and win. He didn't want it quite that way, but in a sense, he now finds himself in that very awkward position that some people occasionally find themselves in, where they've been given what they wanted and find that it might have been best on reflection if they'd not actually got what they wished for. Because in effect, he's told to just go on fighting, forget about diplomacy. The US is not going to put pressure on you to settle or do anything of that kind. But of course, it's been done in conditions where, at least on the face of it, he is mostly on his own. And that may explain a number of really very remarkable statements that Zelensky has been making over the last couple of days. So he's been talking about how he again asked Donald Trump for Tomahawk cruise missiles. Long-range cruise missiles, they could strike all over Russia. We don't hear about the Flamingo missile very much anymore. Just saying, remember that? The big cruise missile looked like a V1. It was ready to be used. It seems to have disappeared like the mist on a spring morning. Just saying. But anyway, he wants the Tomahawks. He said that unless the Russians agree to basically stop fighting and accept his demands, then he will come after them. He will intensify his attacks on their oil refineries. I'm going to say a bit more about the attacks on the oil refineries in a moment. He's going to escalate his attacks on the oil refineries. He's going to come after the Russian leadership himself. We've seen that the Russians are still very cagey about whether they really are targeting Ukrainian military officials. But Zelensky no longer has any inhibitions about this. He talks about how top Kremlin officials now really need to be close to their bunkers because the Ukrainians might be coming after them, implicitly with drones or with long-range missiles. He talks again, there's been more talk from Ukraine about offensives. Some of his officials briefed the Wall Street Journal about plans for a new offensive somewhere on the battlefronts. There might be new offensives. This is all really extraordinary, wild talk from Zelensky. And again, I can't help but think that a lot of this is intended to scare the Russians into some kind of climb down, because the person who is really scared is Zelensky, because suddenly the Americans have pulled the rug from underneath him, and deep down he knows it. So anyway, that's Zelensky. But what is actually going on the battlefronts? Now, over the last couple of days, I have spoken about how the Russian Ministry of Defense has abruptly changed its approach to discussing and reporting about the war. How previously they'd operated what was in effect a regime of silence. They told us, they gave us a general idea of where the fighting was taking place. They gave us confirmation when a particular village or settlement had been captured, that they would sometimes wait up to a month before they did that. They would give their own assessment on Ukrainian losses, but basically that is all that they would do. Whereas over the last month, the Russians, starting with the Chief of the General Staff, General Gerasimov, have now taken to providing detailed information about the situation on the front lines. And yesterday, they took a further step because they published a map which appeared to show Russian gains since the beginning of the year. Now, the map was quite an interesting map, and some people have done close-ups of it and have tried to draw from this map conclusions about where the front lines really are, at least according to the Russians. And I think that this is a correct thing to do, but I do want to introduce a caveat which those who are discussing the map, I notice, are not doing, which is that this map basically shows two types of territory. Territory that the Russians control and territory that the Ukrainians control. It doesn't do what the maps of the various mapping projects do, which is show the grey zone, the area that is being fought over, the area which neither side is fully in control of, the area where the battle is actually taking place. I get the sense, looking at this map, that anywhere where there are Russian soldiers is marked red. That is to say, marked as being under Russian control, even if there are Ukrainian soldiers there also. So some of the things about this map, which of course I'm surprised, I think can be explained quite readily in that way. Having said that, the map, if you believe it, suggests, in fact confirms, a grave operational crisis for the Ukrainians. First of all, it appears to show that the Russians have advanced further west and south of Kupiansk, and that Kupiansk itself is indeed, as some Russian commentators have claimed, essentially surrounded. That all the main supply roads are physically controlled by the Russian troops, and as the Russian Defense Ministry has claimed, Ukrainian troops on the territory of Kupiansk, perhaps 700 in number, are trapped. Well, I think most people who've been following the Battle of Kupiansk closely would probably accept this account, and it corresponds very closely to what the Ukrainians themselves are now admitting, and it's, by the way, what I believe. But we then come to other places where there has been some surprise, because the Russian Defense Ministry's map shows the entirety of northeast Siversk, around a fifth of the town, as being under Russian control. It shows a large area in southwestern Konstantinovka under Russian control, perhaps a fifth of Konstantinovka. And in the area of the August breakthrough, northeast of Pokrovsk, the area where the Ukrainians have been conducting various counterattacks over the course of September, it shows all that territory under Russian control, including the village of Volodymyrovka, for example, and does not appear to have adjusted the map in any way to take into account Ukrainian counterattacks and Ukrainian claims of the recovery of ground. And this has inevitably inspired a certain degree of skepticism. Well, I'm going to say straightforwardly that, as I said, there is a very simple way of squaring the circle, and that is to bear in mind that the Russians are not identifying a grey zone. I think it is highly likely that there are indeed Russian troops in Siversk, and that fighting is going on there, and that most of it is happening in the northeast of the town. That doesn't change the fact that the Russians are continuing their efforts to encircle Kupiansk, Siversk, because most of the town continues to be under Ukrainian control. Radovka provided an account of how the Russians are basically closing their pincers around Siversk, with Russian forces pushing closer to Siversk from the south, and other Russian forces pushing towards the main supply roads from the north to these villages of Yampol and Dronivka, which are both under attack. In Konstantinovka, we have less information, but the Russians have been hinting or talking about fighting going on in southeastern Konstantinovka for some time. And it is likely, my guess is, that there are not large numbers of Russian troops southeast of Konstantinovka. Maybe we are talking about reconnaissance groups and people of that kind, but it is very likely that the Russians are indeed present in Konstantinovka, this area of southeast Konstantinovka as well. As for the territory of the breakthrough, well, the Ukrainians have been trying to defeat the Russians there since the start of September. This area is a narrow salient. The Ukrainians have concentrated very large forces in this area. Radovka has been repeatedly saying that Ukrainian counterattacks in this area have been unsuccessful. And we see that the Russian Defense Ministry says that this is basically true. The Russians still control all their main positions in this area. And, well, again, if we go back a few months to the fighting in Toretsk and the fighting in Kotlino and the fighting in all sorts of other places, we saw that the Ukrainians can conduct hit-and-run attacks, sometimes deep behind Russian lines. Ukrainian reconnaissance troops can be sent, sabotage and reconnaissance groups can be infiltrated through the Russian lines. Ukrainian drones can be flying overhead to monitor their movements. They can conduct ambushes behind Russian lines, and the Ukrainians can publish the film in order to give the impression that fighting, serious fighting, is happening in places which the Ukrainians haven't really reached. We saw exactly this play out in detail in Toretsk earlier this year, and I would not be surprised if the same thing is happening northeast of Pokrovsk. Anyway, if the Russians are indeed correct, though, it bears repeating that Kupiansk does indeed look like it's about to fall, with heavy Ukrainian losses. Siversk cannot be far behind, and the Battle of Konstantinovka is well underway. If all of these places fall, and Pokrovsk falls, then Ukraine is indeed going to face a major operational crisis. And I said earlier in the program that Zelensky gives the impression of being worried and nervous, and this is why he's making these wild threats. And one can see in the light of that why that might be. There also appears to be more fighting going on in Pokrovsk itself and in northwest Pokrovsk in the industrial area. And there are also reports, many reports, that the Russians continue to advance in the areas, in the Dnipropetrovsk area and in the Zaporozhye area, gradually encircling fortified positions like Novopavlovka and moving methodically westwards towards the city of Zaporozhye and the river. So, anyway, that, it seems to me, is the overall state of the battle. I'm going to, as I said, hopefully do a more detailed summary soon on one of my future programs. But anyway, there is no sign of Ukrainians winning the war. All the facts, as we can see, point clearly in the other direction. The Europeans, I am sure, quietly know this. The Americans quietly know it too. And this is the proximate cause for all the fear and worry that is stalking Europe. Anyway, there it is. European leaders, if they were wise, would have more important or more pressing things to worry about. The Economist, British magazine, but one with an international reach and one widely read by the international investment and financial community, has published an edition which has as its cover and lead story articles entitled "Is Britain Going Bankrupt?" question mark. And if you go to The Economist, magazine I rarely read, by the way, but if you go to The Economist, I always glance at it, you'll find a detailed discussion there about the state of the British economy. And on the one hand, maybe things are not quite as bad as some people are saying. I don't agree, by the way, about that. But on the other hand, things really do look very shaky in financial terms, and it could very well be that there will indeed be a crisis in Britain before very long. It is certainly not a vote of confidence in Britain or in the way in which Britain is being managed at this time. One would have thought that the British government ought to be 100% focused on this. Certainly, I think that is what the people of Britain would want it to do. But if my guess that the misrepresentation at the meeting in Moscow, which I discussed at the start of the program, the misrepresentation originates from British sources is true, we can see that for part of the British establishment, whipping up a crisis in Europe is more important than a little matter like the imminent bankruptcy of Britain. Well, of course, there will be some who will say that it is because Britain is about to go bankrupt that some people in London want to create a bigger crisis in Europe, either to divert attention from that or perhaps out of some crazy idea that if you're going down, well, bring everyone else down with you. But anyway, this is where I'm going to stop today. All sorts of complicated games continue to be played. The president, I think, does want to disengage from Ukraine. He does want to disengage from Europe, or at least to reduce the American footprint in Europe. But he lacks the strength or the vision or perhaps the courage to do so openly. So we are left to manipulations and acts of subterfuge. And of course, exactly as that article in Responsible Statecraft says, that opens the way for further escalation. Well, this is where I finish today's program. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop, links under this video. Last but not least, please remember, if you've liked this video, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.